By the way, I don't necessarily presume that we would all rally together in a very serious crisis. All the polls at the moment seem to suggest that young people are unwilling to stand up for and fight for their country in any circumstance.
Hello, I'm John O'Brien. I'm Head of Communications with MCC Brussels, and welcome to another edition of Deep Dives. Deep Dives is the podcast series where we take a more in-depth look at the writing and the research produced by MCC Brussels. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Bill Durodié. Bill has been lecturing, writing about security issues, military security issues, for a long time. And Bill is the author of the report. The report is The Hollow Flag, the gulf between EU security, rhetoric, and real security. Bill, to start with, could you give us an idea of why it is that you called this report The Hollow Flag? What is hollow about EU as a EU security issues?
Well, the point is that there's a hole at the center of where security ought to be. In my opinion, security necessarily has to engage the people of any particular country, at least in their passions, if not more actively. And I think, like a lot of other commentators have noticed, there's a growing gulf between policy and politics today, and that's what we mean by talking about something being hollow.
Why do you think the EU has struggled to meaningfully include the public in its security policies? Is it a design flaw or a cultural flaw?
I think it's kind of inherent to what the European Union is. The EU project as a whole has struggled to get people to identify with it for a very long time. It was part of the rationale between Jacques Delors' famous turn towards social Europe in the 80s. But actually, one of the points I make in this report is that we need to stop looking back to the past to understand the EU and understand that the key disjuncture occurs in the early 90s, whereby the European Union, as opposed to the preceding European Community, comes into being. And really, that is a product of a period where increasingly states are separating themselves from their people, looking more and more towards bureaucratic, technical management solutions in the aftermath of the highly political period of the Cold War. And the demise and the end of that period led to a kind of scratching of heads, a searching for new meaning, new purpose, possibly best illustrated by Zaki Laïdi's book, A World Without Meaning, where he looks at the crisis of purpose at the heart of Western societies.
With the Ukraine war, now more than ever, security is top of mind, and Europe is trying to decide what to do. What do you think it should do or shouldn't do?
Well, isn't it very interesting? I noticed on the way here that EU officials are now meeting with Ukrainians, not to share their advice and information, but really to pick their brains on how and why they've been so successful up to a point in fending off Russia over the last few years, and particularly to learn about their ability to produce their own drones, their ability to train up their own people to do that. I think Ukraine's been successful. Obviously, it came as a surprise to most people, particularly in the world of security, where most analysts were saying they were giving Ukraine 72 hours to survive when the Russian invasion started. But it was really somehow they managed to galvanize their people and to get them on side to the point where ordinary people in ordinary everyday occupations, professors like myself, but ballerinas and others, signed up and said, no, we have to fight for the independence of our nation. And that's really quite remarkable.
But it's somewhat understandable that if your country is invaded or there's a threat of invasion, that people would feel patriotic and would sort of get behind that. We need to defend ourselves. We need to defend our families. But without the threat of war or the reality of invasion, surely it's not something that people think about or indeed want to think about.
It probably isn't. But whilst one might presume that people are going to rally together come the crisis, it's a bit late to leave it till that. You know, if we actually want and are serious about preventing war, and precluding it, then actually what we really need to be doing is getting together in advance of that very pointy moment when the invasion starts. By the way, I don't necessarily presume that we would all rally together in a very serious crisis. All the polls at the moment seem to suggest that young people are unwilling to stand up for and fight for their country in any circumstance. Now, it may be possible that once the invasion starts, to put it mildly, then they would come together. But it is a bit late. And I think the importance to me of patriotism and celebrating an active love and engagement with your nation is precisely to preclude that kind of last minute.
Why is it that people don't feel that sense of duty to flag and country?
Well, going back to my earlier answer, I think the kind of really the early 90s saw a period of disillusionment in the old politics of left and right, which was marked by a clear disengagement of people from the political process. We saw, turnout in elections basically declining non-stop for most of the 90s and, at least well into the early 2000s. And it wasn't so much just the disengagement of the people, it's increasingly their elites or their leaders began to be quite dismissive of the people. They viewed people no longer as those who had elected them and given them authority to lead, but rather they viewed people as problems that needed to be managed. They took on a managerial outlook rather than a leadership.
Yeah, and so your report argues that you can't have a good EU security policy without the people, without the people's involvement. But if you don't let me say so, nowhere in the EU is there the involvement of the demos or the people. The Commission is hardly going around really listening to what people need. It's telling them what they should want and what they don't need. For example, in agricultural policy or energy policy. Why would security be any different?
Well, I think it's going to necessarily be a national thing in the first instance. And whilst you say that nowhere in Europe are people engaged in security issues, there are variations that are worth noting. I mean, the Finns seem to be always ahead in the polls of willingness to stand up and fight for their country. Poland, as you will know, has recently made it known that all young men are going to be enlisted. And I wouldn't put it past a few other countries to revisit the whole national service situation. But having said that, you're right to presume that these things can't be imposed from outside. And that's why, celebrating a love of nation, a sense of loyalty to your community, I think is a necessary building block to being able to stand up and engage.
The report suggests that EU security policy is reactive, that it's not strategic. Can you give us some examples of this? And what are the risks to outsourcing strategy to crises?
Well, look, there's been a long discussion about the need for some kind of European security mechanism going all the way back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. But if we look at the recent period, it really becomes this kind of alphabet soup of organizations and agencies, European security councils and partnerships and defense industry mechanisms, all of which are highly bureaucratic and technical in nature. And quite a lot of analysts have noticed the extent to which the EU talks a good show about security, but actually has very rarely put its money where its mouth is. The only times that the EU has deployed forces within Europe was in the Balkans War, and then there's been a few minor engagements in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily led by France, and some people point to a narrow political agenda by the French in pursuing those. And then the rest of it is precisely because it doesn't know what it wants to do, doesn't know what it wants to achieve, because it's not properly legitimized by its people. It ends up erring into kind of civilian military relations, doing things like peacekeeping operations, policing, operations against people smuggling and weapons smuggling, and talking more and more about things like, supporting various countries in the aftermath of major natural emergencies like earthquakes. But the whole point is, there hasn't been a shortage of wars for the EU to get involved in over the last 10 or 20 years. So it's almost like a diversionary tactic to write reports. Most of us have never heard of the strategic compass for European security. God forbid, hopefully we never will. But so there's a difference between writing reports and fighting wars. And I would suggest the EU as a whole is fundamentally ill-equipped for the latter.
In the conversation about security recently, we saw that there was a difference between countries, a pronounced difference. Some countries like Spain and Portugal, for example, were saying, well, by security, we don't mean going to war. We actually mean a general type of security. You saw that conversation. Like, what's going on there that almost like, a group of stray cats, that they're all going in different directions? The idea of a coherent policy seems to be a pipe dream.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the funniest example of that was, Britain wanting to kind of renegotiate its relationship with its major EU partners, and it descending into a debate about fishing, which Kaja Kallas, notably the European Commissioner in charge of the Common Foreign and Security Policy, had to come out and say, look, we've gone past that now. Although I note that Spain is still holding out over Gibraltar, and others are holding out about student visas. So you've got all this mishmash of issues come into the arena. And I think that the main thing here is that, again, driven primarily by the end of the Cold War security arrangements, when the West faced a seriously armed, with chemical, biological and nuclear weapons Soviet Union, it then went into a period where it had to kind of fish around for reasons as to why it needed to maintain its security forces. NATO actually suffered from the same problem. And so there's this kind of searching around for new things that never really sticks.
So how does the EU approach to hard security differ to that of NATO? And should NATO lead, as your paper recommends?
Well, it's worth reminding people that paper was written almost 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
And obviously that was during a Biden presidency, although we had Trump version 1.0. Now we know what Trump version 2.0 says in relation to NATO and his demands that European partners stand up and fund their defense elements more appropriately. So, I think there's been an entire shift there, but sorry, I might have missed the key point of your question.
Should NATO be leading on these things, and how does the EU approach differ to that of NATO?
Yeah, I think NATO does stand for something else. It makes no pretense of being a federalist body. It makes no pretense of appealing to national populations either. The reason I went down the NATO route in that paper is it's better equipped, better organized. It's got a longer history of working together. And of course, NATO is changing. If the US completely pulls out, then it becomes something else again. Notably, for instance, Turkey is in NATO, but not in the European Union. And Turkey's a significant player in the military stakes in terms of arms production, people under arms, a point not lost on Emmanuel Macron recently, because one of the EU's recent proposals is to invest 650 billion euros into the defense sector with an additional 150 billion euros for partnerships with industry and through loans. And Macron's made a point of saying that only EU members qualify for the loans, which is a kind of veiled swipe at Turkey.
Yeah. Europe is not in any way a monolithic people. So how can EU security respect diverse national outlooks, like the one I referred to earlier, that Spain and Portugal would see security in a completely different way, while aiming to have some idea of common defense. How can you balance those two things?
I think we have to start with the reality that the European Union is neither a federal body that pools the sovereignty of its member states, nor is it purely just made up a club of independent nation states. Rather, and again, the point I've been making all along, it's very much like nation states, is it's a body in transition which represents a separation of those governing from the governed. Now, we can see that in microcosm within independent nation states that, let's say if we take the United Kingdom, where I'm from, for example, the people have disengaged and there is more and more bureaucratic processes to kind of determine how things are decided. But the EU is that writ large. And I think that transformation is the fundamental one to watch.
The report links economic growth and peace. How strong do you think that connection is today?
Well, you can't have a serious defense industry if you don't have a serious industry. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the recommendations in the report is the need for considerably more investment in innovation, not purely defense directly innovation, but innovation as a whole. Now, we know that the European Union prefers to position itself as the kind of world regulator of industrial affairs, rather, like basically clipping profits from, people in China or the United States, rather than having a serious manufacturing base of its own. And I think it's an important point that we need to go back to the need to not just have strategic autonomy, as Emmanuel Macron would put it, but just the capability of making large numbers of necessary equipment. For example, NATO's main submachine gun is, I think it's called the Herslat. It's made in Belgium, where we're sitting right now. They're finished by hand. It takes 2 hours to put them together, to file them down and finish each one by hand. The production capability is 3,000 to 4,500 a year. That's not a serious weapons capability.
If you could write the EU's security policy from the ground up, where would you start?
It shouldn't be a policy. It's like, actually, for years, quite a few analysts have been noting that there's endless policy documents emerging every day from governments, from think tanks.
Too much policy.
Absolutely. And what we really need is some strategic thinking, which actually, in terms of democratic organizations, used to be called politics. So where would I start? I'd start by trying to reinvigorate public life and the political sphere. If you don't have people who care passionately about their communities, about their country that they happen to be situated in, you're going to be in trouble when there's a crisis. And the trouble isn't going to be the crisis itself, but rather the absence of loyalty from the people that you rely on to deal with emergencies.
Is the idea of Europe as a political project sustainable without a shared sense of collective purpose?
I don't think so. And I don't think that the EU is capable of creating a shared sense of collective purpose. I think the reality is, and will remain for a considerable period of time, that it's a collection of 27 member states who really ought to focus on their own national priorities and then come together with a strong sense of representing their people, rather than coming together with a sense of what does the European project require. I think in many ways what matters most here is the transformation from what we understood to be nation states, that was government for the people, by the people, as Abraham Lincoln famously put it, to what we now call member states of the European Union. Member states are really the representatives of those nations meeting in Brussels in the European Council or the European Commission, and in many ways feel more connected to other like-minded individuals from the other member states than reminding themselves that the authority that they have is actually comes from the people that they are meant to be representing. I think we've forgotten that politicians are meant to represent the interests of people, and it's high time we found out what the people wanted.
As a professor, you've invested a lot of your life in education. What role do you think education plays in shaping public trust or mistrust in European institutions?
Well, obviously, education's really important. I have misgivings of, in relation to what passes for education in many organizations and institutions today. But if we look at the university sector, say, where I'm based, I think it's absolutely vital. But most important in that is the ability to openly and freely speak one's mind and, say without fear of either being embarrassed or causing offense or being shut down, to be able to experiment with ideas. I mean, here we are today, just before an event that some marginal fools tried to put a stop to in Brussels yesterday. If I were the mayor of Brussels or the mayor of that particular district in Brussels, it's absolutely crucial to openly criticize what happened and to say, look, I'm a democratically elected person. We rely on democracy, and for democracy to flourish, people need to be able to speak their opinion freely, irrespective of whether we agree with that opinion or find it challenging or anything else. And therefore, you might find that mayor would actually win and galvanize some popular support for their next election if they were willing to do that. I find it quite remarkable that the mayors remain silent in this environment.
And it was admirable that the Prime Minister of Belgium last year, when there was an attempt to censor another meeting here, it seems to be the thing in Brussels to censor other people's voices. But when that happened, the Prime Minister, who's from the left, defended the right of a more conservative group to actually hold and to continue that meeting. So there are people who are willing to stand up in that way. Sadly, too few of them. One final question. If the EU wants the flag to be full, not hollow, what's the first thing that they should do when they wake up tomorrow?
I mean, obviously, we welcome the intervention of the Prime Minister at the time, but, words are cheap. And sometimes you actually have to follow up those words with more active intervention or a constant reminder that, closing events down is unacceptable. I think it happened last year because some of the speakers were so high profile. They included a prime minister, a government minister, and various other quite important dignitaries that the Belgian prime minister couldn't let it pass. But it's actually, democracy starts at the small scale. Precisely events like the one that's happening here tonight, that's what needs to be defended. Precisely the conversations that people might have in a classroom, that lecturers might, experiment with ideas that people find challenging and problematic. That's what needs to be defended.
The very title of your report goes to the question that the flag is hollow, that there's something really missing here. If the people in the EU really wanted to, make that flag real, what is the first thing they should do when they get up tomorrow?
They should go out and start talking to their own people. They should start representing the dominant ideas that those people put to them. We know that ordinary people have a very different set of values and agendas to what highfalutin European commissioners have. If you look at the agenda of people at the top, it's often things like climate change and net zero, gender pronouns, or the war on terror. when you talk to ordinary people, it's the state of the economy, their job, healthcare, and their children's education. I don't think that people's basic concerns are represented at any level in the European Parliament or the European Commission. And as long as that continues, there is a disconnect.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Bill Durodié.
Thank you.
You'll find Bill's report, a link to Bill's report, in the notes below this podcast. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Deep Dives. I look forward to you joining us again for another in-depth look at the reports and the research by MCC Brussels. John O'Brien signing off.